we have here an incredible mixture of different expertises, which is pretty unique in a way. And so I think the goal of this hour is to discuss what is missing in current theories, computational theories of the brain. And of course, I know that maybe 30% of you have a finished theory in your head of how things work. But so let's. So what I would say. So we don't want mini talks here about the theory, but on the other hand, we want to pick your brains and get the ideas out, right? But so keep that in mind. So just stay in the flow of the discussion. And I would say, as a general way of structuring this, maybe there is kind of different aspects to a model of a computational model of the brain. And of course, it's always neat to have, but of course, one can ask, what are the goals, right? So, what kind of brains do we want to model? But then also, what are the ingredients? Or also on a more normative side, what are actually the computations? So we have heard about reinforcement learning, apparently, which is very high up, that this is something, but is this, control theory? Is the brain a controller? We have heard about working memory. So we have certainly here started to fold out certain principles, but is there something lacking? And of course, I know there's more talks to come, but so those are kind of different things that it would be great to collect here. And maybe to just get started is, what do you think, what was really missing from the discussion so far? And okay.
Now, get it out of the way early. It seems that the one experiment we aren't really talking about is the one all of us can do right now. If you look out the window, you can see leaves in the trees, and you can probably get an estimate of how accurately we can represent the visual world. And for me, I'd call it teravoxels. And it's changing quickly. And yet, I know that the input driving my teravoxel simulation this minute is at best a megabyte per second. Maybe only 10 kilobytes if you believe in rate codes. So somehow my brain has got a million-fold amplification to understand all of this. How do we do 3D so well in our heads? And how have all creatures done it so well for millions of years?
Okay, I mean, if no one here wants to start, then I start. So, I mean, what I found a little bit lacking, so I think, reinforcement learning, clearly a very important principle, but I think there are other intrinsic drives of actually exploration and behavior that actually are not so well described by a situation where you rely on quite immediate rewards. And so I was missing also kind of model-driven curiosity as actually a drive. So think of a little kid well-fed in a room with a lot of toys. There's a beautiful kind of time-compressed version on YouTube. This child engages with every toy in the room in the course of 2 hours. There is no food, no direct reward involved here. So what is the drive? So I would be very interested in kind of model-based internal drives that are not directly related to an external reward. I think this is a principle that we also need to understand better to have self-learning and lifelong learning systems.
I think Wolfram Gessner has written some papers, I've forgotten what exactly is in there, then more as a postulated variation of a learning principle.
Well, there's many. I have also written papers. I mean, there's many people who have written papers about this, and it's old. It's actually it's kind of old work from statistics, which is kind of optimal experimental design. So a lot of these models, these more normative models of how actually exploration can happen by an agent in an unsupervised fashion, they are based on optimal experimental design. That since the 50s is around and has then been taken up by Schmidhuber.
Right, yes, I'm just described here now, he's in charge. Yeah, there were some hands then?
Yeah, yeah, go
Okay, so I work on probabilistic programming, describing probabilistic models and performing Bayesian inference in them. And so something that I'm really interested in when I come to a workshop like this is, right, in computer science we have these really powerful tools, for translating things at one level of abstraction to a lower one, right, that serve as barriers. So, I'm always wondering whether there are, what kinds of theories of neuroscience of how the brain works. What properties would a theory have that would allow us to build, these barriers of abstraction, these levels of automation on top, right? How could I compile a probabilistic program? Right, a probabilistic program to a neural representation, something like it.
So should I write something which addresses this more general problem that we want to have a kind of an abstract language of describing brain computation and learning, and then look at the compilation problem separately, or specifically for probabilistic programs, which is a special case?
Probabilistic programs are being, cognitive scientists like to, are interested in sort of these normative Bayesian models of cognition, and so I guess what kinds of computational models of the brain, admit automated translation from higher levels of abstraction, like from probabilistic programs to neural hardware.
So actually, is there some work in your field where it goes the other way around, where you really look at data and you try to infer these more abstract?
Yeah, there is, I think. There's certainly people try to find. They'll, I guess, look at hardware systems that look kind of like that are sort of neural networky, right? Or virtual machines, I'll say, not actual hardware, right? And then try to find representations of programs on those that fit data.
I think specifically for probabilistic programs, I am not aware actually of good ideas how this could be implemented with even neural networks, artificial neural networks, right?
Right,
so typically these probabilistic programs now as probabilistic models, and they're somewhat detached from
Yeah, so there is some work on like sort of representing probabilistic models with stochastic digital circuits that look sort of like spiking networks, but I think it's on the whole it's very detached from certainly empirical data about the brain.
I think particularly also of this work of your Tinbaum's group, right, where I could even even genetically encoded or transfer knowledge takes the form of probabilistic programs, right, and it's then applied to support one-shot recognition or something, one-shot learning, right, and so this I think is really cool program, and we're missing the next imitation steps.
Yeah, so lots to know people, that's lots of them.
Yeah. So I think, you were asking reinforcement learning, or I don't know, deep networks or so these are different paradigms. And I think we will need pretty much all of them, or variants of all of them. And then integration becomes a big issue. I don't think that we're a machine that does end-to-end gradient descent overall. I think there are sub-modules and that relates to your question of curiosity learning. So how do the sub-modules sort of do something reasonable, or relates to unsupervised learning? Right? So somehow the brain is very modular, and the substructures have to learn by themselves without really being told in detail what to do. So that poses a question of sort of what are the unsupervised learning principles at work there, and how to integrate everything. And another thing that I think was lacking completely is something more abstract like reasoning or so, right? If you really go sort of to the symbolic representation that we are obviously able to do, but I think we don't have the language at all to, there are some attempts, but it's very limited in terms of sort of how to get from the neural, sort of the stimulus, the perception to abstract symbolic representations, and then do something like reasoning, right? It's completely off of that.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, the first point that you make, you know, there's different functionally specialized or many in the brain, and they can, under certain circumstances, communicate with each other and form a functional network. People call a functional network, and do a certain task. This is. It's very hard to grasp in a model. So most of the models that we have are kind of looking at a local area, what the neurons are doing, for very good reasons. Because if you ask what is 10 different regions, what are 10 different regions in the cortex doing together, there's tons of unknown parameters, and so it becomes very unwieldy. But I think this multi-scale aspect of brain activity and brain organization would be very important somehow to connect to the computational theories, because this is also where there's a lot of data then from different imaging techniques.
Maybe also, I think I wouldn't even know how a single learning module works, and I think we have certain traditions of modeling learning, any type, unsupervised, supervised, or reinforcement learning, but if you try to relate it to the data, and particularly if you go to synapse physiology, I think the link is typically rather weak then, and I think we got used to kind of a certain learning models or learning rules which are just accepted by the community, but I think they're not accepted by the neurophysiology community necessarily, or at least they're questionable, and I think which makes it then even more difficult now to put several such models together. Each of them is kind of questionable. And for example, what I'm missing is not just everything related to consolidation. Is just I kind of very semantic wisdom or so then, right? But it's kind of doing something very powerful, and I'm missing there, any tangible rules which you can then try out in the network.
Yeah, so obviously one thing we're interested in is whether there are mechanisms in the brain that compose. What do people think about that? I mean, we have come up with little toy examples, but where are there separate mechanisms that have circuits that combine to produce an effect that builds on what separate pieces are doing? Or is that just hopeless? Maybe there's just too much interaction.
Well, I think, the data is coming in. There's connectomics data, so we are starting to get, I mean, for a long time, people did not really know much about the connectivities which span farther distances in cortex, because it's just very hard to trace these fibers. But there is, of course, better and better data coming. So I think, on the experimental neuroscience side, there's now also an enormous need in actually good computational concepts that make predictions and can be tested. I think this is really something to keep in mind, that now actually we are getting to a realm where, National Institute of Health, they are putting out programs and are looking for theory frameworks, because they are drowning in data. So the last 5 years, the first 5 years of the Brain Initiative was very much focused on gathering data, getting better data of neural activity, of connectivity, and so on. And now they want to transition to understanding this data. And so I think there is a very important need now for computational theories that make testable predictions, right? That make predictions that can be linked to this data somehow.
Maybe can you make this more explicit? No, probably you're thinking of kind of whole brain imaging, or almost whole brain imaging.
It's on all levels. I mean, there's calcium imaging is scaling up to 10,000s and probably soon 100,000s of neurons. So we have so it's in terms of really recording single neuron activity, not quite at the single millisecond resolution. It's calcium imaging. It's a little bit low pass filter, but not much. So that's one, but then there's massive connectomics efforts to really reconstruct the anatomy on the EM level, so on the resolution level where you see synaptic contacts. So all this data is now becoming available, and it's all supposed to be shared and investigated. And now we need concepts and frameworks to actually make sense of it. And this is now realized. And so it's an enormous opportunity, but it poses, it's really, the goal of the theory then has to be, okay, what testable predictions can be made that somehow connect to these data? Or also, you know, how can we inform, I mean, with all the new techniques that are now available to monitor brain activity, to measure connectivity and structure in the brain, what is the next killer experiment? What is the next experiment that we could inform, that we could help to design so that we get an answer that we can then use to test our theories?
So I think that one concrete instance of this problem will maybe addressed tomorrow by Jason McLean, who talks then about this population events, assemblies and assembly sequences. And I think that many kind of theoreticians try to now kind of create a computation theory. How do you compute with assemblies then, which is something different than computing with neurons, because the assemblies are somewhat kind of loose kind of collisions of neurons then. And so it just, I think they're in the way of using traditional concepts like the concept that a single neuron is encoding something, or that correlation between neurons is coding something. These are kind of larger distributed assemblies of neurons which probably communicate with assemblies in other brain areas.
Yes.
And so there's obviously a problem that what is the right modeling level or conceptual level? Should you view an assembly as like a binary variable, it's on or off then? But then you're missing this kind of loose aspect that on each trial the assembly really engages a somewhat different set of neurons then. On the other hand, if you do this on a neuron level, now you're losing the structure because everything becomes so complicated.
Yeah, I mean, the assembly concept is a very interesting one. Very old, basically started in a way with William James already, entirely without data, but then of course with Donald Hebb, and then with Carl Lashley, and it's still around, and there's now data also that some for and some against this assembly concept. So some of the data, like Dietmar Blenz's data at NIH, he sees more these 1/f distributions where it doesn't seem to be certain fixed sets of assemblies of cells that always go on together with each other, but it seems more like a scale-free phenomenon. But so there's actually interesting statistical data also where one can now start. So for a long time the cell assembly hypothesis was considered an experimentally untestable prediction if the assemblies are small and sparse, because one couldn't record from enough neurons. But this is now also changing, so we can now really spell out what what the cell assembly theory would predict, and one can look into data.
I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're looking for, but I'm not sure that I understand at the moment what is the right primitive, in some sense, to describe the brain. Is it a neuron event, right? Is it the synapse? It's of course a bad analogy, like every analogy is a bad analogy, but describing, I don't know, this gas in the room in terms of molecules is not the most useful thing, right? We have sort of new emergent degrees of freedom of one way or another that may be better than the thing that actually exists there, right? The individual neurons, the individual synapses. And then another thing which I guess it's maybe is a bit of a out there in some sense, but can we, this is a question I keep on asking myself all the time, but can we even understand the brain until we are able to connect sort of whatever theories we do with the big C, with the consciousness, right? I mean, this is fundamentally what we are, right? Sort of conscious beings, and can you even have a theory of brain without making this connection somehow quantitative, right? And I have no idea which way even to try to start.
Yeah, I think there's really also experimentally we don't have good access to what consciousness is. I think we are not. I mean, right now it's.
Actually,
but how
I'd like to disagree then. I think if you look simply at different authors who have published papers about consciousness, you find that most of them have actually one definition, but everyone has a somewhat different definition. Like, and Stanley Hann has written a book about it. They have a very precise definition, but this is probably not what Ilya has in mind then. So I think, I hesitate to write it down because I think partially the problem around consciousness that everybody has a different idea in mind, what consciousness is or should be then.
But I think this is because
you can talk, for hours and days without making progress. You have to make a list what aspects of consciousness to really address at the moment, then, right? And then by one, I think one can deal with the question of how to model this or what evidence for against this.
Yeah, one thing that I haven't heard very much here, and that is just the tremendous capacity of our brains to store information. So memory, long-term memory. I mean, and how fast it can form and how permanent it can be. And we probably will not find answers to that kind of question simply by looking at simple neurons. I think we need to develop a theory of computation that is rich enough to capture in a physical system the behavior that all of us depend on. Like a musician can recall hundreds or thousands of tunes by just hearing a little bit of it. And some of us, many of us, switch from one language to another, but we never lose our accent. So some things get established early on, and then they stay with us, and other things are very flexible, and we can, things like that, we can express the same thing in two different languages, and it doesn't, the next day we don't even remember in what language we heard it. So something like that, a physical system is able to do because our brains do it, and we really don't have a good theory for that, but really need to look at, psychologists know a lot of interesting things that we could look at, so I would say.
Maybe you can help me about the write down, because I think I hesitate to write down what's missing of memory models, because the literature is full of memory models, starting with Hopfield networks, so we would have to address what are particular deficiencies of existing models then. Can we know?
Well, like Hopfield net, how much can you store in a Hopfield net? Not a lifetime's worth
Well, I think the theory
of
says in principle they have high capacity, right? It's linear and you have billions of neurons, so why isn't this enough then? So I think this is not really capturing, I think, the difficulties. Right?
Well, we don't.
I don't want to defend Hopfield models. I don't believe in them, right? But I think we have to kind of make this more precise. What is missing in Hopfield model?
I think what we're missing, what Pensy's getting at, is the immense capacity.
So don't they have high capacity if they have linear capacity?
Well, what you're making a theoretical argument. That's great, but let's implement this in practice. And one experiment we can look at is the experiments of Standing in the 1970s. He measured the capacity for picture memory, and it's a really astounding experiments where they just showed human subjects pictures. As you saw, like one picture, a second or two, and they're just like photographs of an entire scene. And what he found is the capacity for your memory there is on the order of 10,000 pictures, meaning I can show you a study list of 10,000 pictures and then come along later with a test picture and ask you was that in the study list or not. You're way above chance. And it takes a week to do the experiment, to have a subject sit down and watch all these pictures. How do you build a neural network that does that in a sort of holistic and robust way? And I think that's there's an explanatory gap there. We still could make these maybe theoretical scaling arguments, but actually implementing that in practice and making it work and making it robust is something.
So you argue that there are more memories in the brain than there are neurons in there, so that you need a kind of
It's implemented with neurons, but the organization of that memory is very important.
So it's not just sacrifice, but organization, right?
Organization in two ways: physical organization, and then organization of information in terms of ability to access it. So you have both a physical plant, and then you have an algorithm that can use the physical plant so that you can access the memory with very fast with vague cues and actually cues from different senses. Means
I think the invariance of memory is very interesting, but I'm not sure that the capacity is such a mystery. For example, there's an old result that the Hopfield model for recognition memory has a capacity that's order n squared. So it's not that hard to get a capacity of 10,000 with even a simple Hopfield model. I'm not saying that's the way the brain does it, but it's in principle not a very difficult puzzle. I think human memory, actually, there's no strong evidence that it's extremely high capacity, right? For example, the White House, right? Our lives are determined by the inhabitants of that house. How many columns does it have? You've all seen it. But I bet nobody really knows. But nothing you've done in your life. So the human memory, I checked actually, that's 4 on one side and 6 on the other. I didn't realize it has columns on both sides. But I think what Penty's getting at is the incredible invariance of memory, the stuff that we can get memories through different modalities and store them in a unified representational system and so on and so forth. And that we forget everything that's irrelevant to us and preferentially store what's relevant to us, how we determine relevance at the time of storage. Memory serves a purpose, a very human purpose, and how is it that circuits combine purpose with memory storage? I think those are fundamental issues.
So you're arguing for kind of adding in something that you want to have selectivity for important aspects of memory? Or
something like that, yeah. And there's another thing that's happening. I mean, given technological advances, I think a lot of theorists are having this. Experimentalists are coming to us and asking us, now I can do anything. I can record 4,000 neurons. I can even do all optical read and write. I can play in any activity you want into V1 or orbital frontal cortex. I can record the response of 4,000 cells there. What should I do, right? The fact that we as theorists can't often design killer experiments to tell them exactly what to write into the brain suggests that our theories are not negotiating the correct trade-off between sort of abstract power and precision at the level of biophysics, right? Like I see lots of really interesting questions about rooms for deeper abstract theories, some questions about like biophysics, but how do we match the two to give justice to the incredible technology development that's happened now? And how do we turn that technology development into conceptual advance? I think that's one of the main challenges that we proximally face as theorists.
Yeah. I would actually, for a moment, just propose also one other deficiency of existing memory models. I'm not sure who of you has addressed this. I think one thing we got so used to in a Hopfield network, what you store there as binary patterns where you clamp each neuron to be 1 or 0 then, right? And so this, I'm not even sure how a brain could do this, right? You see something, how do I clamp my neurons in my deeper and higher brain areas, right? So therefore, there's something, there are hidden neurons in the brain, right? Which are not clamped by the external input that you memorize. And I'm missing really kind of interesting models for memory which have hidden neurons, right? And make use of these hidden neurons, recruit them for certain memories, and connect them for certain memories, right?
Yeah, and I think that's related to the formation of abstractions, right? Because that's what those hidden neurons should be doing, is forming abstract semantic representations that constitute the basis for our memory in a modality-independent fashion.
Yeah.
Another thing I think is worth pointing out that when we are born, right, we cannot walk, we cannot talk, we cannot do any of that thing. And it's not just training the network, it's actually building the network. The brain keeps on developing up until age 20, right? And then there's a very small stable period and then it starts sort of inevitable processes, right? And I think that this is a part that we are missing in many of the theories which do not look at the long-term development, right? How do you build the robust brain, robust behavior, right? Rather than train an already existing structure, right? And I think it's a very different, potentially very different questions. And a relevant, and a similar thing maybe, is I don't think we have enough data at the moment to understand, for example, like you and I can walk, right? And we have brains. How much variability is there between the, let's say, motor behaviors that you and I exhibit versus how much variability is there between the brain structures that are responsible for that behavior, right? Is there more of one or the other? how do we develop this sort of robust behaviors, and do we need actually robust development for that or not, right? I just don't know the answers for that, right? So it's this sort of, brain doesn't get born, it gets built, and we don't pay much attention to that.
So you're addressing robustness or stability of behavior in view, in spite of no variability in the brain areas? Or
So here's an example. Sorry, I'm sort of saying a bit much, but newborns, when they are born, when they are born, they cannot focus beyond about 3 inches or 4 inches, right? And then you can only focus at infinity by age 9 or 8 or something like that. I forget the real number. The newborns do not get trained on images with all sorts of details that exist in them, in these images, because they don't see the leaves and faraway trees, right? Unlike the sort of when we train a network, right, a deep network. Is there something there? Are there some principles of how one builds sort of the more robustly performing, robustly acting things which are not just instantaneous training, but building together with training? I'm not quite sure I am formulating it right, but I hope it sort of, the message is clear.
I think we should probably try not to widen the discussion about everything unknown about the brain, but really what is missing in computational theories about the brain, right? And so this would be then maybe be the question of kind of how to have a theory of robust kind of development. I'm not sure what it means, because development is something huge right now.
But isn't it just how do you build up this hierarchical structure where there's some things that are, like Pentti was saying, less malleable than others. So some things that are supporting the sort of really complicated functions that we tend to want to start training networks on without realizing that there's actually a lot of automatic functions that we've learned over the history of our lives that is fairly invariant, right? Such as the accent or the way you move it, and it's all necessary so that we can walk around and then change our actions, like learn how to use a text when we
So
were
you're
born
asking
using
for
cell
theory
phones
for
and stuff
development, or for the development of computation? Because I think then, in principle, you can dream up many things, right? But I would immediately get into the lack of data. And so how can you do theory in spite of this lack of more quantitative data about
there's
development?
also a reverse side to this. So you cannot assume that everything is learned. I mean, every person has visual cortex in exact same place, right? So it doesn't just randomly wire up so that we can see. Or even more, I mean, if we look at non-human animals, a fly gets out, it closes, gets out of the pupa, and it can fly almost right away. An ungulate, or a lot of precocious animals in general, they can run faster than we do a few hours after they're born. They don't learn. The fly doesn't learn to see. It's born seeing. So a lot of the actual what we think as the learning models, there's actually an infrastructure laid in the axonal guidance in all the developmental structures, which is certainly, I mean, our genetic code doesn't code for strengths of specific synapses, but it codes for the way the brain wires up. It sort of codes for the meta rules, which then allow us to learn efficiently. But a lot of these meta rules are actually genetic.
So I'm trying on this to filter out things related to computation theories, and so I see the question how kind of really robust behavior can be programmed into a network, right? As we understand, the genetic code does it, right? And we are missing, if it's a recurrent neural network, I find it very hard to program anything, kind of robust into a recurrent neural network. And so, is this the right way of writing this question, how can robust computation be installed in neural networks?
And maybe also, I mean, are these networks actually, to which extent these networks are actually stereotypical for you and I, right? Or everybody in this room? I don't think they're the same. They're not, I mean, they, on the general scale they are, but is the difference in our behavior driven by the fact that we actually have slightly different brains, or what is more different, the brains or the behavior?
This is a little bit of a comment, a kind of meta comment about the discussion and thinking about how a new field of science emerges. And so famously, Thomas Kuhn talked about the emergence of paradigms and what goes into those. And what I find, I'm a historian of science, and so listening to the discussion, it's interesting to, I think maybe one thing that's missing is thinking about what are, I mean, that's what this process is, thinking about what the paradigmatic problem is. Kuhn famously said that fields emerge by solving paradigmatic problems that then attract researchers to that problem. When I hear this discussion, there are multiple different paradigmatic problems. And though what is a paradigmatic problem for Professor Ganguly and Professor Deneuve is quite different from what is the paradigmatic problem from someone in neuroscience. So my one suggestion would be to think about, A, what is the paradigmatic problem for a particular group of people and what their training is that makes them see that as a big paradigmatic problem. Because Kuhn also, of course, said that the paradigm is an imagined endpoint of what the science would be in the future. And those endpoints, which Professor Ganguly is describing at once a certain theoretical level of abstraction, that's a standard that you are bringing to this discussion as part of your so in that respect, I would say one big distinction is those people who think of themselves as simulators of the brain and modelers and simulators versus those who are thinking of the brain as computing. And I see there's kind of like two different, there's a little bit of tension and kind of two different endpoints.
I wrote here, what could be a single paradigmatic problem about computation theories for the brain? This is, I think, my essence. I must say, actually, in my dark hours, I ask myself to what extent can I actually convince myself that what we are doing is science then, as opposed to really systematic speculation then. I think there's certain characteristic features for science, for example, that they really take experimental data really serious, and I don't see this really in my community. And so I think this is a little bit loosely inspired by experimental data, but I think it's not, driven by experimental data in the same way as theoretical physics is driven by data from experimental physics then.
But I think it's both ways. I mean, it's also that the experimenters often do not really pay attention to what theories are. They come up with their own theories, for the better or the worse. And so I feel there's an entire field. I see this now as a chance that these very puzzling data are now coming in the experimental labs. This is a chance to maybe come up with a common paradigm, which is really something that actually unites theory and experiment. I feel sometimes if you look in theoretical neuroscience, there are these little clans of people who adhere to certain ideas of models and kind of defend them. And what we really need is to get to the cycle of experimentation and testing predictions of a theory and then improving the theory and so on. And I mean, that could maybe be such a common paradigm. So I don't think this can just come from us as more the modelers and theorists. And I think also there is actually not, I mean, no one just wants to simulate the brain. I think it's always, you always want to understand there's always, even in the most complicated simulation, there's abstraction involved.
justified.
And I think what's interesting is just to be conscious about and think about what are the standards of the different subgroups making up this, who come together today in this room, and what would the standards be in the future. So I just in this discussion, I've heard testing hypothesis, robustness, hierarchical structure, a higher theoretical level of understanding as kind of standards, which are not conflicting, but they are different. People bring those to the fore as their requirements for valid knowledge today. What will be in the future, we don't know.
Actually, I also made one comment. So I'm, as somebody know a little bit comes more from kind of mathematics or machine learning, I'm always concerned simply about this meta aspect of overfitting. Then we all the time we build models, which have many more parameters than what we want to model typically, right? And if we succeed with this modeling, I'm not sure what it tells us then, because assuming then the next day the experimental data that we want to model are kind of really withdrawn then, and it turns out just opposite is true. We go back to our model, and I'm certain we will also be able to reproduce this kind of completely different experimental results. So I'm not quite sure whether we really provide really useful understanding of experimental data by modeling this experimental data in a way that can be described as overfitting from the perspective of statistics or machine learning.
On the positive side, what are the computational theories that are not missing? I just want to know what you guys agree on. Just name one or two things that everybody says, yes, for sure, this is part of the grand theory of,
Existence of neurons.
Yeah. No, but I mean, that's too low level. Maybe something more higher than that. No, really, I mean, I think that would be a good, if we can't answer that question, there's something really wrong.
I think that we had a similar discussion in our Geneva farm a few years ago, and then a well-known researcher gave a few examples for such things we really also we can show as proof that neuroscience has made progress. And one of this was mentioned that we have this reinforcement learning theory, that we have this global reward signals, and then we have a principal understanding of reinforcement learning or machine learning. And for me, for example, this is something which is not so clear. If we look at data, which was mentioned like Ilana Witten from Princeton, they really questioned quite a bit this global reward signal, for example, in the brain, right? It's both kind of different kind of dopamine kind of outputs are sent to different brain areas, and also it's known that they don't just signal reward. So even though those examples which seem to be prime candidates for such theory everybody agrees on, I think they're a little bit kind of becoming less firm ground than in the face of new emergent experimental data then. So maybe we can best agree on those things where we have few experimental data to question them.
I think the problem with this agreement is also that we're all working on different problems, and within a problem I think there's some agreement about things. Maybe that some hypotheses didn't work, so they're not favorable anymore, but there are usually two or three competing hypotheses. So I think partly petitioning, and I think you also made the comment, why shouldn't we just all focus on one problem and solve that, right? And I think it's actually good that we split over different topics, but that also makes it difficult. It's virtually impossible to agree on one thing if there are different groups working on different things. So I think it's very hard to come up with such a generic list.
The problem I'm asking myself once in a while is the distinction between supervised learning and unsupervised learning in machine learning. And I wish we have some clarity in terms of in the brain, actually, what percentage of the cake, as Jan de Coon would say, is unsupervised learning, what percentage is supervised learning? I mean, not percentage as in quantifying it, but I feel it's at some very abstract level, it's a very important distinction between these two paradigms. And I don't get this clarity when I go to neuroscience about the importance of it.
So, I hesitate to write this down because, in principle, I think it's often a matter of perspective also, or semantics, really, what people call supervised, unsupervised learning. I'm not sure whether, I don't see the scientific issue behind this, or the scientific open problem. Maybe somebody can help me.
Yeah, so I come from machine learning, so I really know very little about neuroscience. And among the many things that are really wrong with machine learning, there's one thing that seems to have worked, which is rallying a community behind benchmarks, as horrible as many aspects of this are. But maybe connecting this to a couple of things that came up in the last couple of questions might be interesting. One of them is, what can everyone agree on? What theories can people agree on? Well, maybe there's also a list of tasks or canonical types of experiments or aspirational type of, if you wish, performance on some things that one could connect. And that also addresses some of the first things that were addressed, for instance, model-based learning, model-driven learning, integration of diverse learning modules, and so on. So is there a list of, if you wish, tasks that a collection of theorists could define that everyone agrees on, these things should work? And then questions like the last one, what part of the cake is this, what part of the cake is that, become a question of empirical inference, right? You can actually test this. I mean, you can't test.
That might even define the distinction between that engineering field and what one might say is basic science theorizing, which is you guys get benchmarks.
Well, actually, I think neuroscience is discussing a lot about benchmarks, and there are efforts now, like this International Neuroscience Institute, well, actually, about 15 labs were all on the same decision-making experiment in a rat or a mouse. So there are these things, but of course, neuroscience doesn't want to give up the diversity because it's not clear, maybe it's, for example, the progress that we have been making flying brains, and for example, the compass neurons and stuff like that. There was amazing insights in very small brains, but then you could say, okay, what does this help us to understand cortex in a mammal? And but for now, I think it's definitely we should work towards benchmarks. Is also the other tension here is you want to study naturalistic and complicated behavior. From the more neurons you recall, then actually Surya has a very nice kind of theory about that, that if you recall from more and more neurons, you also want to study more and more naturalistic, more and more complicated behaviors. But for that reason, neuroscience hesitates to say, okay, everyone studies now this behavior, because we might zoom in too early onto something that, for example, in vision, people for decades have just mainly studied these very artificial stimuli, like sine wave gratings and things like that, And then we came to the conclusion that actually, if you build the best models that predict the neural firing in viewing these artificial stimuli, it doesn't help you to predict what actually the neurons are doing if the animal views a scene that it actually encounters in its natural life, a natural scene.
Just to clarify,
before we drift on, maybe you can stay for a moment still at this question. So you are giving a particular position about this question, about benchmark tasks for computation theories. I think it's a very nice suggestion, and I think we should possibly try to decide it's impossible or useless, or there exist candidates for this then. And I think this may also be addressed, some of this overfitting problem, because in computer science, since you mentioned this, when you have an algorithm, you don't just verify that it works for 5 different inputs, right? No, it should work in principle for all these exponentially many different inputs. And so this is a typical benchmark task for verifying the performance of an algorithm, right? It's not quite clear now what this would be then in an...
Well, I think it's, for example, sharing data. That's a very important thing. If someone does an experiment, right, and then writes conclusions in a paper, share the data, let other people, that's kind of a concept of a benchmark.
There's a little bit of a finer point to what I was saying. Obviously, people share data, everyone has their own experiment. Each single model is tested for a particular phenomenon it is testing. But there's a bigger point that is already on that board, and that is, one, what can we all agree on? So maybe there's a collection of tasks that could be outlined as a map of what an integrated model of many of these things together has to be able to do. Two, it already talks about model-based learning. There's already a point about integration of different modules. So what I'm arguing for or questioning about sort of is not how would we evaluate each single model and how are people creative about testing each different type of, if you wish, phenomenon, but bringing some of these aspects together and testing them as a whole. Can we think about what are the tasks as a whole that we say, a computational model of the brain should be able to address?
I think yeah, we should maybe collect more opinions to this important point. I think one experience, just ahead for many discussion of this point of this type, they often arrive at some point at the challenge for benchmark task, and then they say, okay, let's collect some benchmark tasks. It never happens, and next year we come back to the same point. So there is apparently a reason why we never manage to agree on benchmark tasks, right? So which could be really be rooted in the nature of our discipline or our society simply, or how we work. Then I think maybe we should address why we never can really realize this good idea to agree on benchmark tasks. So there seems to be something principle there.
Yeah, so I think, there are some problems that are modeled a lot. For instance, receptive field development, right? There's a whole community trying to explain or to model how visual receptive fields develop from whatever, right? So in that sense, I think there are some common phenomena that are being modeled. But what also is important for a benchmark is the criteria by which you evaluate the model, right? It's not only the input data, also the problem that you want to solve, but also the objective function. And I think that's something that's much less clear than the task itself. And I actually, somehow, maybe I have the idea that this is actually good, that we don't decide on one way to evaluate it, because it's completely unclear what a good evaluation would be, right? So we need not only sort of algorithms that get better and better at this task, but at the same time also the way we evaluate it develops. And it's good that researchers have the freedom to come up with their own evaluation. I think there's also a danger with benchmarks, right? If there's a benchmark, then you optimize for this benchmark, and then then the fourth digit after the point, right, gets optimized, and one sort of loses the focus on sort of what could be for conceptual advances, right?
Just speaking of benchmarks, so just to have something very concrete in mind, the ImageNet classification was a benchmark for a while, but now it's the bounding boxes and figuring out where things are in the picture. Is there any chance of, or would something like that exist, be useful, or is it completely not something that would be useful for the neuroscience community? Understand classification, understand how the position of the different things on the images and such.
So addressing maybe whether one can classification tasks like ImageNet, whether they can be used in order to probe different models for learning then, right, for visual system.
We're not asking what models perform this brain-like function better in that performance. We're asking which are good theories. So how are we evaluating, to this point, how are we evaluating the goodness of the theory by benchmark? I think, ironically, the machine learning revolution in the last few years has given us the only story that theorists are going back to what Surya mentioned, which is like, what's a theory of the brain that we can make predictions of? And people jumped on it. They said, oh, yeah, the brain is a convolutional neural net. Look at all the receptive fields match up to the kernels that we learned. And that's a theory now. It's become a theory. It came out of this totally benchmark-driven, forget about neurons, just do it the best way you can given these computing resources or whatever you can get your hands on. Don't tell us how many computers and GPUs you actually use and how much time, but figure out this problem. But most of the problems that neuroscientists look at are actually not that hard anymore. We used to be able to say, gosh, the human brain, you can balance better, it can do can understand spoken language, and we're knocking these down at a rapid pace now, but we're doing it in a different way, although now we're saying maybe it is the same way. But you can't use performance benchmarks of tasks so much and apply that to theories. I mean, theories have to be satisfying a sort of a reductionist level it's hard to quantify. I'm not sure. I mean, how would you have a theory that you have this is a better theory than this? This is a topic of much human discourse.
But just to bring this up, Box's loop says, right, that if you don't have data, you can't test your theory in any way.
So that aspect, yes. So having common data sets and trying to consolidate people around research programs, absolutely. The problem in neuroscience, the diversity of organisms and tasks and what have you is certainly in tension with making, progress on single things.
And the only thing that I was sort of advocating after looking at what theories can we agree on is, can we agree on a set of tasks and data set, which maybe jointly theory should be consistent on. So instead of optimizing for a single thing each time.
So you want a theory of the whole brain, everything that a human might do in its lifetime. That's
First, just define tasks that maybe we think matter.
But one point to follow up. As this gentleman's pointing out, the benchmark worked really well for deep nets, but as you're pointing out, it can also be constraining. And as I understand it, the LSTM idea is kind of mimicking hippocampal function. That was where it kind of came from. And Professor Moss's work, which now does equally well, had to come from the outside. So it was not the product of benchmark. It's introducing a totally different kind of quite different approach to solve the same problem. But it was not benchmark driven. Neither of those two innovations were benchmark driven. So the benchmark can.
Since I think in some sense we benefited from simply standard tests in artificial neural networks, right? Now how do you test an LSTM network? What are they good at, right? If you wouldn't have this, then I think it would be more difficult to simply characterize that these adapting neurons bring progress to these networks, right? So there was a certain kind of really skeleton or framework, right, of tests, and then comparison models. I think this helps. I think, and we can use, I think, more of machine learning models and results simply as a comparison kind of framework for models than.
If I may change the subject a little bit, so perhaps we can learn a lot from other theories, from other disciplines that have been very successful, and I'm thinking about theory of computation, Turing, and then computational complexity. I'm thinking about general theory of relativity. I'm thinking about the theory of evolution that started from Darwin. So if you look at all of these theories, what do they have in common? I mean, clearly they were very successful, right? Well, one thing is that they were not trying to explain every observation, every data that has been collected in that field. I mean, Turing was not trying to, say, how do you design a computer in hardware. So I think an interesting thing about these theories is that they were setting like a new agenda. They were basically perhaps motivated by some observations from experiments data, but they were really like providing a new framework, a completely different agenda on how to approach understanding, say, gravity or understanding, evolution. And of course you can find exceptions that perhaps those theories don't explain very well, but that's not the point, right? Here in neuroscience, what I find out is that we're very easy to basically kill theories because, oh look, this doesn't really agree with this observation.
But we also have many of them, That's the problem. So of course we would like to compare theories and eventually kill some. That would be very good for the field.
Going to maybe another point. How do we understand individuality? How do we understand individuality? Because the point is that there is no average mouse, right? There is no average human. And I don't see that, like in the proposals that we heard here, or when I review grant proposals, we are building a model of an average mouse, right? And I don't know how to reconcile the average with variability.
No, isn't there a triple answer? Sometimes if you view these organisms also as learning system, typically now if you even in the model you instantiate the same learning algorithm with different initializations, you will get somewhat different results then, right? Isn't this a typical effect of learning-driven systems? That there's not a canonical solution, but several solutions that work?
I agree with this, but on the other hand, when we take experimental data, we typically try to fit the average learning curve, right? We do not try necessarily to fit, for example, in learning experiments, the distribution of possible learning curves that would come out from experiments versus from your learning model, right? And I think that this potentially trying to fit not the average behavior but individual trajectories, how an individual bird learns to sing, will actually tell us quite a bit about how the bird brain works rather than the average bird brain.
Well, there's been work from Eve Marder's lab from about 20 years ago that just shows that averaging fails spectacularly, that you have regions of correct function in the parameter space, but if you take the average over individual parameters, you end up in a region which corresponds to something absurd. So yes, absolutely, yeah, that's an extremely valid point. But
I'm trying to write a few words because in some sense I think it's nice, but also it's something hard to reconcile with the goal of theory, right? With theory, you want to have a general invariant rules frame right now. So now this is a theory of individuality, which is now, I'm not sure what is the theory about this, or how should we phrase
well,
this?
I mean, so of course, then the search is for principles that actually are as well to produce these different individualities.
So that one wants to have invariant principles which explain many different individual kind of solutions to a computational task, right?
Okay, we are nearing the hour. Is there any more very important?
Can I just make a small comment about the benchmark question? I noted that people use visual illusion to make claims about whether their theory of vision is realistic or not. Would that qualify as a benchmark?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean,
just to have a concrete example.
Yeah. Okay. Then thank you, everyone. I think we are nearing the
blackboard is full. But I think we have material for another workshop here at Simon's.
Okay, thanks a lot, and see you.